What you got?
I had me one of these when I was a kid. Strawberries.
Hey, buddy, you might want to keep your mouth shut.
How's that for a transition? Good morning. Welcome to Crossroads. I'm Reed Robinette. I'm the senior pastor here. And if this is your first time, you picked a great morning to join us for the first time. We're launching into a brand new series of messages this morning, and we've entitled it To Infinity and Beyond. And so we've done a few Disney things. And let me just give you a little test here right off the beginning. Who knows the name of the bear who was just up there? Lotso Bear. Yeah, somebody had it over here. A bunch of people had it. Only one person at the whole 8 o'clock service knew. They're a little bit removed from the Disney theme. You see what I'm saying? So Lotso Bear. And what happened? The Lotso Bear answers this question. He's in the third of the installments of the Toy Story movies. If you're not quite familiar with Lotso, he sort of answers the question here, what happens to toys after they get thrown out? What happens to bad toys after they get, and apparently the answer is they get strapped to the front of a garbage truck, and they should keep their mouths closed, right? So, we're not going to talk about Lotso Bear anymore, or Disney for that matter. We are going to talk about this, that question, what happens to toys after they get thrown out, sort of mimics in a fun, lighthearted way, a really serious question that we ask all the time, which is, what happens after this life? What is there? Is there something beyond what I experience here? Is there something else out there? What happens when you die? And those are all questions about eternity, right? And so those questions have been asked by every society since time began. Every culture asks those same questions. What happens? What else is there than what we experience here on earth? Now, there are all kinds of different answers to that question. Maybe you've been in a philosophy class in college, or there are all kinds of answers. You dissolve into the oneness of the universe. That's one answer. I don't find that one particularly comforting to me, but that's an answer. One answer is you come back. You are reincarnated as something or someone else. And depending on how you did like this time around, you may gain a few spots or you may lose a few spots. Depending, that's another answer. One answer is, well, you end up in some other place, but you need all your stuff with you when you get there. So you might have seen this. So there are tombs that have been unearthed and excavated where especially the rulers or the rich people, they got buried with all of their earthly stuff, right? Because they thought that they needed it wherever they were going. Now, before I tell you which answers I think are right and which ones are wrong, I want to ask you a question about the question. In other words, what do we learn from the fact that every culture, every society since the beginning of time has asked that same question? What happens next? What else is there? Is there anything to be learned from simply the fact that everybody seems to ask that question? And I think that there is. C.S. Lewis, who often says it better than most, wrote about this question, and he said this: creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. He says, a baby feels hunger, well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there's such a thing as water. Do you see what he's saying? The fact that we ask questions about eternity suggests that eternity exists. Why else would we ask questions about it? In every other area of life, the desire for something indicates that the satisfaction for that desire is a reality. He goes on and he says this: if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. So he says the questions that are asked lead to a conclusion, not the answers to them. The fact that you even ask them leads to this conclusion. there is something out there. That's the reason that we ask. Well, as it is wont to do, the Bible simplifies it. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, you might know this verse. It says about eternity, He, God, has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. We live in the middle. But do you know the reason that everybody asks the same question? Because God placed eternity in our hearts. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that understanding about eternity is an important thing for us to do. And if you were going to understand about eternity, how would you go about getting that answer? Or maybe the question would be, who could answer that for you? Anybody in the room here would just be postulating, would just be saying, well, maybe it's like this. Well, maybe it's like that. Who would be able to tell you about a place that you've never been? Somebody who's been there. Yeah, somebody said it. You find somebody who's been there, and look, now every now and then somebody says that they died and they came back, and that, there's a little book, Heaven is for Real, and all the little kid and all that. That's great, but we don't have to wait for somebody to do that, because God decided it was important for us to understand eternity. And so God reveals eternity to us. And we can know about it. And it makes a difference. So here's what we're going to do. Over the next month or so, To Infinity and Beyond is a series that's going to look at the importance of eternity. And not so much like what will heaven be like when we get there. That's an important topic. That's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the fact that there is a heaven, that there is an eternity. What difference does that make in my life today? What difference should it make in my life today? So we're going to start this morning with one of the first discussions of heaven in the Bible. It's in the first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis. So if you have a Bible, you want to follow along, I'm going to be reading out of Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 17. This is an amazing, it's one of the first expressions of heaven in the Bible. It's also the backdrop for a great Led Zeppelin song. So you'll catch up with that in a minute. All right, so Genesis, see, some of you weren't interested until I said Led Zeppelin. So come on back. Genesis chapter 28, verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. Then when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on earth, with its top reaching to heaven. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on the earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you. I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Now, this is God's word. And in it, besides being the backdrop for Stairway to Heaven, it provides, I think, a picture, a display of the fact of eternity. And then it talks about the effect of heaven. And then it talks about how to get there. So I want to do all three of those. Let's look at the fact of eternity. Let's look at the effect of heaven. And then let's look at how do you get there. And I'll give you a hint. It's not buying a stairway. All right? So, number one, the fact of eternity. We might just gloss over this, but the passage explains that there is an eternity, and you can't skip this point. right? And it talks about heaven 3 different times: before the dream, during the dream, and after the dream. It talks about heaven. And the implication is this: there is an eternity, and that means that everyone lives forever somewhere. That's really important. And you can't jump beyond that and start talking about what eternity is like without understanding the power and the importance of that simple fact. That almost everyone lives like they believe that. Now, C.S. Lewis makes it really clear again. He says, Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever. And this must be either true or false. Would you agree? Of course. I mean, it has to be either true or false. So we can't skip this question. Now, before you decide how you would answer true or false, let me say again, I've never met anyone, I've never had a conversation, I've never read about anyone who lives like they think that's false. Now, even the staunchest atheist that I've ever known lives like they believe there is an eternity. Here's why. Because everyone that I've ever met lives as though there's purpose to life, lives as though this life has value, live as though there's meaning to our existence. And that demands that there's an eternity. Do you see that? In other words, if you came from nothing and you're going to nothing, what does that leave the meaning of the middle of? Nothing, right? Nothing, nothing, nothing. And almost no one that I've ever met or heard of lives like there's no meaning, there's no value to our lives right here. And so let me express it this way. Almost everyone in the room probably agrees that it's wrong for people in power to use that power to oppress and abuse people. Would you agree? Who votes against that? No. Powerful people should just be able to abuse whoever they want. Whether it's a dictator in Rwanda or a college professor. Right? Okay, so you're in a college classroom and the professor says, okay, all the women in the class, you fail. Women, what do you say? No, that's not right. That's not fair. Why? By what standard are you arguing that? If there's no meaning to what we do, if we're just an accidental collision of atoms, then what makes your accidental collision more impressive or important or right than mine? Who cares? Right? If I can get ahead, why wouldn't I? And so all of you are uncomfortable. You're like, no, that's not right. Of course it's not right. And that's why I say almost no one lives like they believe that there's no eternity, that there's no purpose. Again, I'll say C.S. Lewis said it a lot smarter than I can, and this one's long, so I put it up on the screen. He says, let us begin by supposing that nature is all that exists. Let us suppose that nothing ever has existed or ever will except this meaningless play of atoms in space and time. That by a series of hundredth chances, it has, regrettably, produced things like us, like ourselves, conscious beings who know that their own consciousness is an accidental result of the whole meaningless process and is therefore itself meaningless. Though to us, alas, it feels significant. Why? Because it is significant. And everyone that I've ever met lives like they believe that. Everyone knows that it's wrong to throw the girl babies into the river. You know that. But you can't know that if there's no eternity. There's no basis for it anyway. So we start with this. The fact of eternity. It's so important. There is an eternity, and that means everyone lives forever, somewhere. Now, the second question is, well, what effect does that have on how I live today? What's the effect of heaven? Now, one of the challenges when you start talking about how heaven affects today is our tendency to disassociate life there with life here. Very common tendency. In fact, we almost see them as diametrically opposite or completely separated, or at least in a negative way. Here's what I mean. We tend to see, well, life there has almost nothing to do with life here, even if we believe that they both exist. That's why, who wrote the song? Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to go now, right? The two things are not connected. Someday, awesome. Doesn't really affect now. Or there's the belief that thinking too much about life there adversely affects the way that you live life here. You've heard the saying, they're so heavenly minded, they're no earthly good. Yeah. That all they think about is heaven, heaven, heaven. And this life now is falling apart because those two things affect one another negatively. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Correctly understood, the effect of heaven is completely connected to life here on Monday, on Thursday, to the actual everyday real life that you live. It's completely connected and extremely positive. In fact, let me say this. There's no way to have earthly good without a heavenly mind. Now, hold on. I'm not saying that no one does good on the earth if they don't believe in heaven. That's not true. Lots of people do good on earth even though they don't believe in heaven. I think it's incongruent, but they do it, and that's great. What I'm saying is you can't even label anything good without the reality of heaven. Do you understand that? I can tell by the way you're looking at me. Let me give you an illustration. Some of you know what this is. Some of you do not. Has one of these. Some of you are like, what is that thing? And it's a radio. By the way, for those of you who are unfamiliar, it even has a tape player, a cassette. Thank you. A cassette tape. Now, if I was to want to answer the question, is this a good radio or not? I could not answer that question unless I first knew the answer to the question, what's it for? What's the purpose of the radio? Now, if you thought that the purpose of the radio was to download music, it would be a bad radio, right? Because you could sit here all day and push the little buttons and ain't nothing downloading into this model right here. Now, if you thought it was to open the garage door somehow, and you drove home and you're like this, you would, bad radio, right? If you knew that the purpose of a radio was to gather radio waves that at this moment are circulating all throughout the room, even though you can't see them, and to collect them and to turn them into music that you could hear, well, then you could check and see if the radio was a good radio. And so I would go like this. See, and now I'm not saying that's a good song or not. 98 Rock was like the one that came in the clearest, so we use that. And people who listen to 98 Rock still listen on one of these. That's the way that goes. I digress. The way you can know it's a good radio is if you know the purpose of it. Is this a good life? Well, in order to answer that question, is this a good deed? Is this a good choice? You would have to know the purpose before answering that question. There's no other way to answer the question than to know the purpose. And you can't ascribe purpose if you come from nothing and you're going to nothing. The middle means nothing. But it doesn't, and you know it doesn't. And here's why. Because there is an eternity. And that affects everything that you do now. The scripture that we just read, after Jacob's dream, God said that the effects would be completely practical. He gives this list of all of the things that will be affected because there's a heaven. I will give you land. Your descendants will become numerous. They will move in all four directions, north, south, east, and west. You will bless the whole world. All of these really practical takeaways are from the reality that there's a heaven. It's completely practical. Now, I'll give you one more illustration, then we'll move on. Tony Evans, a pastor in Texas, asked these questions, and I thought it was just brilliant, and so I'll ask them to you. I can't do the accent like he does. It's much more fun to listen to than me. He said, what would you say, kind of like that, what would you say about a lion that couldn't roar? What would you say about a fish that couldn't swim? What would you say about a dog that couldn't bark or a bird that couldn't fly? What would you say? You say there's something wrong. Why? Because they weren't doing what they were built to do, what they were created for. They weren't doing it. And he says, there's so many lives that aren't doing what they were created to do. Well, how do you know what you were created to do? You look ahead, and you look at heaven, and you understand what you were built for, what your purpose is. And if you're not doing that purpose, somebody should be raising a red flag and saying there's something wrong here. He goes a little further, and he says, and what would you say about a lion that tried to live underwater? What would you say about a dog that kept jumping off of buildings trying to fly? How is that going to end? Poorly for the dog and the lion, right? Why? Because they're not only not doing what they were built to do, they're doing something that they were never built to do. And without the reality of your purpose, you'll never figure that out. You'll end up not doing what you're supposed to, what you're designed to do. You'll end up doing things that you were never designed to do, and it will end poorly for most of us. The effect of heaven is completely practical. We're going to unpack that a little bit more next week. So look, we looked at the fact of eternity. Everyone lives forever somewhere. We looked at the effect of heaven. It absolutely is connected with how you live your life today. Well, how do you get there? That's the last one, right? Isn't that what everybody wants to know? How do you get there? And this passage paints such a beautiful picture of how it's not actually you get to heaven, it's actually heaven gets to you. And this is a marvelous picture of it. I got to give you a little backdrop, though, to understand. The encounter was with Jacob. I've said his name a bunch of times, and if you don't know who Jacob is, you miss a little bit of the story. So let me give you the 20-second primer on Jacob, right? He was in the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, whom God had chosen to bless the world. And he was also a twin. And when he was born, God said that the younger would be the one that was blessed. And that happened to be Jacob. But that's not the way it worked in their culture. And so Esau, the older brother, thought it should be his. And there was family dysfunction. You want to look at a dysfunctional family, look up theirs. You'll feel better about yours. They were a mess, right? And so at the end, right before what we read today, Jacob dresses up like his brother Esau, puts on like fur, because Esau was a hairy man, and he goes in and he tricks his dad, he lies about who he is, and he steals the birthright. And now he's on the run. He's running literally from his family for his life, because Esau wants to kill him. And that's where we pick up the story. Now, I tell you that because the first thing I want you to see is the setting in which this encounter with God takes place. It's incredible. And the writer here does a masterful job in about one sentence of painting this picture. So you've got Jacob, he's on the run, he's stolen the birthright, and it says he comes to a certain place. Well, why'd they call it a certain place? Because they didn't have no name. Because it's literally in the middle of nowhere. Then it says the sun had set. Don't you know in movies, when they're painting the scene, when the sun sets, it doesn't just mean it's nighttime. It means that darkness has come. And then it says He laid down to sleep, and he got a rock for a pillow. Did that catch anyone when I was reading it before? How bad does it have to be for you to choose a rock for a pillow? Anybody here ever use a rock for a pillow? Why? Because it's a terrible pillow. It communicates, it doesn't get any much worse than this. Why do I tell you that? Because that's where Jacob encounters God. We can tend to think that those circumstances, that setting, means that God is absent. And that's completely false in Jacob's case and in yours. And listen, I know that this morning some of you are running. You're running from relationships. You're running from finances. You're running from God. I know that for some of you this morning, the sun has set. It is dark, and you're thinking, I don't know that it will ever come up again. I know that some of you think, rock for a pillow? Yep, that's about right. That's what my life feels like right now. And if that's you, I want you to see Jacob. Because through all of the lying and stealing and running, sun setting, rock pillowing, God shows up. He has an amazing encounter with the God who created him. And so, if that sounds like you, you're in a place where you can encounter God right now. Now, Jacob sort of makes the point and then completely misses the point. It sounds like me. I think that's why I like him. So first, he sort of makes the point. And in verse 16, he wakes up, and look at what he says. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, not was, is in this place. And I was unaware of it. I didn't know. And he begins to see through all of, bless you, through all of the running, all of the lying, all of the stealing, he is found by God. God was present in all of that. Notice, he wasn't praying for God. He wasn't seeking God. He wasn't doing the right thing. Nothing. And God encounters him. That's the gospel. Do you see that? That's what our God does. He finds scoundrels on the run and then comes and stands over them. That's what this says. Stands over them and says things like this. I will be with you. I will watch over you. And I will provide for you. Do you hear the power of that? Yeah, that's the gospel. And then Jacob responds, verse 17. It says he was afraid. What was he afraid for? Because he's in the presence of God. And he's a scoundrel. He's like, uh-oh. As soon as he realized God is in this place and I am in this place, this might end badly for me. And so it says he was afraid. And he said, how awesome is this place? It's none other than the house. It's the presence of God. And then he says this last line. This is the gate of heaven. Now, that phrase is packed with meaning. You might think cult or something like that, but it's used previously in the scriptures, and it's used a lot in the time of Jacob. You would be probably aware, if we went back to Genesis chapter 11, it was commonplace in Jacob's time to build edifices that would approach heaven, right? You've seen the pyramids. What are the pyramids? They're just stairways to the gods, to heaven. And if you went back to Genesis chapter 11, you would see a pretty famous one in the Bible was a tower that was built, right? And why was it built? It was built so that the people could reach heaven. And it was called the Tower of Babel, right? And Babel means gate, right? And so this is the gate of heaven. And the prevailing thought was, well, and it's still the prevailing thought, isn't it? that there are steps that you take, and somebody's going to tell you which ones are the right ones and which ones are the wrong ones. And if you get enough steps, then you make it to heaven. And where were those? They were always in the near where the rich people live, because they could afford to hire the builders and all that. And they were always in prominent locations for prominent people. And then Jacob goes, "Oh, wow. What is the stairway to heaven doing in the middle of nowhere to a scoundrel like me?" That's the gospel. And I don't have time to go into all this, but if you go then to Jesus in the New Testament, he has this encounter with a guy named Nathaniel, and he says, "I saw you under the tree." And he was like, "Oh, I didn't think anybody was there on the tree." And he did this thing. And then Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man lifted up and angels ascending and descending." Not through him, on him. Jesus says, "I'm the stairway." That's why you're not annihilated, Jacob. Because I am the stairway. It's not so much that you get to heaven, heaven gets to you. Now, he misses the point, as do most of us. So the gospel comes to him and is amazing, and he draws the wrong conclusion. Watch how he does it, verses 20 to 22. So Jacob, in all of that greatness, then he says this, watch. "Then Jacob made a vow to God." That's what you do, right? You make a promise, you make a commitment to God. "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey that I'm taking and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely with traveling mercies to my father's household, then, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth." Yay me. He completely misses the point. Do you see it? He basically says, well, if God will do all this for me, all the things that I've decided that God should do, then you can be my God. And aren't you lucky that I let you be my God? And which would beg the question, would it not? Did you get into this thing for you to serve God or for God to serve you? I'm not asking Jacob, I'm asking you. I'm asking me. And we might not say these words a lot, but I have conversations where people, I think, feel this, and I feel this. This idea that, well, God, you owe me. Like, look. Like, I go to Sunday school, I memorize these verses, look how much money I give, and I did that stupid serving thing when nobody else would do it. God, you owe me. And you might not say that, but if you feel that, here's what I know. Whoever is owed is the one that's in control. Whoever is owed is the one that's in control in the relationship. And you, my friends, are not in control of God. And so, we'll stop here. This was not the end for Jacob. That's such good news for you, is it not? In fact, if you fast forwarded another 4 chapters, you'd find that Jacob has another encounter with God. This time it's not a stairway that he finds, it's a wrestling match. And he holds on to God for all his life. He holds on to God. Even when it hurts him, even when it injures him, he won't let go. And he says, because you're all I've got. Some of you are there this morning. Some of you need to stop running. Some of you need to stop pretending. Some of you need to hold on. You need to stop trying to buy or build a stairway to heaven. And you need to hold on to God for all you're worth. And you are worth a lot to Him. Now, at the end here, I'm going to invite the band up. And we're going to give you a chance to respond, because I can't respond to God for you. Believe me, I need to respond for me. I want to give you room to respond to God. And this last song we're going to sing has these words in it. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that's within me. Do you know what that says? I am holding on to you, God. I understand that you are still after scoundrels like me. And you love me. And that's all I got. And that's all I need. And you can do that this morning. Let's pray. God, thanks for eternity, for building it into our hearts, for loving us, for pursuing us, even scoundrels like me. And so I pray that every heart in the room would see you standing over them and saying, I love you. And that we could hold on to that like there's no tomorrow, because there is a tomorrow. And that makes all the difference. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.